Good morning, Patriots and freedom-loving Americans. Welcome back to the finish line. We're going to do something a little bit different today, and this is going to be a special episode. I didn't plan to do an episode like this. As you know, usually we cover what's in the news, and then I talk about the Epstein investigation, and we do something fun at the end. But I was reading the news yesterday, getting ready for the show, and something stood out to me that I really just couldn't overlook and do a regular episode after hearing about it. And it was the fact that our national debt passed $39 trillion. And the number keeps getting bigger and bigger every year, obviously. It just passed $38 trillion, I believe, in October. So in only 4 months, our deficit has grown by $1 trillion. And that number is not even starting to register with us. It's just so big that our brains don't like to comprehend what it really means. And it's just an issue that we continue to kick down the road. And I'm going to be the one to bring everyone back to reality. We can't do that. We can't continue to ignore it because the cost is devastating on to the American people. And I'm going to go over what this crisis could end up looking like. And please, I know you hear about the debt all the time, and it's just starting to become something you want to block out. Please don't block this out. I believe this is the single most important issue facing our country right now. And I don't say that lightly. It's bigger than the fact that we are coerced and almost controlled by a foreign government. It's bigger than the fact that we let 9 million illegals in during the Biden administration. It is bigger than the fact that Trump has betrayed his base. I believe that this is the single biggest issue in U.S. politics right now. And if we don't fix this, we don't have a country anymore. So let's go through how the debt deficit works. I know not everyone is super economically minded, so I thought we might as well start there. So the U.S. government brings in revenue, usually from taxes or tariffs in this case, now that Trump has been back in office, and uses that money that they bring in to spend on things that they deem necessary. For instance, the U.S. government last year brought in $5.23 trillion from taxes and tariffs, and they spent $7 trillion. So they spent more than they took in, and that's what's called a deficit, is money that they didn't actually raise that they're spending. And this happens every year. We had a $1.77 trillion deficit last year, and we usually average about $1 trillion deficit per year. During the COVID years, deficit spiked to $3 and even $4 trillion. So how does this happen? How does the U.S. spend money on things that it doesn't actually have? And that is because the U.S. has what is called a central bank, and that's the Federal Reserve. So we'll go into the history of this, but for now, the Federal Reserve is a private bank that controls all of the nation's money supply. It's basically where we store the deposits, but they also lend money to the United States government because they're not actually part of the U.S. government. They're a private bank that acts as the lender to the U.S. government. It's a really weird and screwed up system that I will go into in a second. But they lend the United States money at interest. And it's really interesting because the United States doesn't need to actually get money from its citizens to pay for things that it wants. It can borrow money from the bank, from the Federal Reserve, even though they have to pay at interest later. So it creates this endless borrowing cycle. The U.S. government can spend on whatever it wants anytime. So here it's a but this is a budget wheel, basically, how the U.S. government spends our money. 9% Medicaid, 13% Medicare. So that's already 21% of your money is going to health programs to make healthcare more affordable. If you're very economically minded, you would know that these subsidies to help people with healthcare, usually older people rely on these programs, actually makes healthcare more expensive. Let me demonstrate that. So let's talk about how this would relate to college. I like to use this example. FAFSA is a program that makes college more affordable for people. However, the colleges realize that the government is helping people enrolling in college pay for college, so they raise the price because they're like, oh, it's not going to be as hard for people to get into college. The government's giving them money. So by that logic, we can raise the price of our institution. Same thing happens with healthcare. That's why healthcare has gotten so expensive, because of not only government subsidies, but government regulation. Doesn't let the market act at will. So this 21% on Medicare and Medicaid helps people in the short term, but it really screws the rest of us, the younger generations, that have to think about these higher healthcare costs as time goes on. We spend 22% on Social Security. Social Security is obviously another program for older people that we're paying into, and it will be bankrupt by the time that we are old enough to receive it. Just another government Ponzi scheme. It was created to make people dependent on the government. It was created to make people dependent on welfare. Here's the really interesting one. We spend 14% on the interest on the debt. So 14% of the money that the government spends is paying back the Federal Reserve for the money that they borrowed. It's horrible. 30% on spending kind of miscellaneous education, law enforcement, veterans benefits, scientific research, and it's kind of funny. A lot of the things that the U.S. Government is spending on are things that states could be spending on. They're not things that the U.S. government necessarily needs to have an interest in. For example, education. The individual states spend on education, but the U.S. government steps in and even spends more. And it's really not a good thing to have something like the Department of Education, because it lets the United States government dip their toes in what your kids are learning in school. It's the same with the healthcare system. When the U.S. is spending on healthcare, the U.S. government insiders get to decide what kind of healthcare is given by where the money goes. Similar in scientific research, the U.S. government gives its money to certain programs that the U.S. government agrees with. So there's a massive bureaucracy handling these things, and they're really pulling the strings about which policies are implemented. If you remember Common Core, that was a U.S. government policy, and it wrecked a lot of school kids' learning abilities. In a darker note, think about all the COVID vaccine is good, all this stuff that led to the deaths of hundreds of people. And even if you don't believe that, which is true, we can go into an investigation of that in another episode. I'd be happy to, because there's so much facts to back it up. Even if you don't believe those facts, it is very scary to have a government that decides education policy, healthcare policy, science policy. That is a way too big and influential and powerful of a government that our founding fathers never intended. And you'll see that none of these programs are really constitutional, because the founding fathers didn't want the government to have a way on these things. The founding fathers intended that the government would spend on, the federal government would spend on defense, military, and keeping our borders safe. And that is only 12% of what we spend on today. The founding fathers intended that the rest of the spending would go to the states because they are closer to the people. It's more decentralized, so you don't have a massive bureaucracy at the top deciding everything top down, because that can get bad really fast. I mean, that's no different from what some of the most authoritarian governments in history have done. And so, as you can see, we have a massive problem here. And the question is, why do these congressmen and women keep spending this money when it just puts us further and further in debt? And the truth is that a lot of donors give them money to do this kind of thing. And a lot of these programs are popular. And a lot of the Congress people just care about staying in power and getting the money that they want. They don't really care about you. They don't care about the future generations of Americans that are going to suffer for this. And it is a really very, very sad thing. This debt and deficits are just going to continue ballooning. Even under Trump's administration, you know, the Republicans talk all this talk about balanced budgets, but they never really do it. And here's why. These programs are popular. They would lose a lot of votes, they fear, if they got rid of them. And the Democratic response is, hey, just raise taxes. If you raise taxes, then we can spend on all those things. And the Republicans say, no, we want to cut taxes. Republicans are the party of cutting taxes, but that means you bring in less revenue. And the Democrats still have a lot of influence in Congress, and in turn for cutting taxes, they demand more spending on these programs. And so you just get this constant deficit ballooning in both Republican and Democratic administrations. And it's sometimes faster in Republican administrations. Republicans are always the ones talking about the debt, but they're also cutting the taxes, which means less money flows in, and they're also compromising with Democrats on spending at the same time. So again, there's two options here. We can spend on all this stuff and raise taxes. That hurts Americans. We don't want that. It takes more money out of our pocket. That would be the Democratic response. And my response is that, no, we need to cut these programs. They're harmful. They hurt future generations of Americans. We should be cutting taxes and cutting spending at the same time, not raising both. And the one enemy, I believe, of this whole program is the Federal Reserve, as I talked about. The U.S. government can just constantly borrow money from them. So how did this happen? Because the Federal Reserve didn't always control our money supply, and we couldn't always borrow from them at bay. And I like to do this. I like to go out to how America was intended to be to help clear up some of the issues that we face today. So I'm going to go way far back, and let's answer the question, what is money? And money, obviously, is a means of exchange. And the earliest money was created by things that were scarce, because things that are scarce create value. When there's a small amount of things, people want those more. And eventually, over time, I'm giving you the quick version, it was commonly agreed to use gold as money, since it was extremely scarce, and it was also a valuable metal. It is honest, and it has value. And that was used as money, these tokens, throughout most of history. Now, flash forward to the Revolution, the American Revolution, that is. The U.S. government, the fledgling, new U.S. government that was fighting a war of independence, was trying to fund themselves, and this tactic had been used in the past, but they used paper money. Money that was considered valuable by law, not by actual value, as money. But as the war effort continued, they kept printing these bills. And the more bills that were in circulation, obviously, the value of the money just naturally depreciates. That's what inflation is. And these were called continental dollars, and they were almost useless by the end of the war. And you might have heard the phrase, "It's not worth a continental," and that's where that comes from. Is that our early government, this was prior to the Constitution, was just printing money at bay because they realized, like, oh, if this is money by law, we can just print more and more of it to save face and help us in this war. But they run into that law of nature, that something that is expanded too much and printed too much loses its value. And so that whole system fell apart. And so at the Constitutional Convention, when we were designing a new form of government, it was agreed that the U.S. government cannot fall into this mistake again. They cannot print money, or what they call it is bills of credit. And so the Constitution determined that the U.S. government would coin money based on gold, silver, and copper. There was no idea that the U.S. government was going to use paper money at the time because of the drastic failure of that experiment. So the Constitution wanted to base us on an honest money system: silver, gold, copper, things that have value, and that was how things were supposed to be. So this beautiful, honest money system created under the Constitution lasted for a grand total of 2 years. And the reason was because of an absolute traitor to the Constitution named Alexander Hamilton gained prominence in the Washington administration. He was appointed as the Secretary of the Treasury. And while Jefferson and Madison had these visions of America as a nation of farmers and small businessmen that were very independent and just working to self-sustain themselves, Hamilton had more of a vision of the United States as this absolute financial empire, this rich country of elites that would gain prominence on the world stage. And Hamilton had this very, very ambitious economic plan. So first of all, he wanted to assume all the state debts and create a federal deficit, or a federal debt, I should say. Why would he want a federal debt? Well, what he wanted to do was pay this off by issuing bonds. And he wanted wealthy people to buy these bonds, which are basically promises that the government will pay you back at interest for the money that you give to them with these bonds. And he wanted a bunch of, richer elites to buy these bonds and have the U.S. government pay them back at interest, so that there would be an attachment with the wealthiest, most elite members of society and the government to keep it floating. He wanted them to have a stake in it. He wanted a close tie between these two groups. He also wanted to create a national bank to hold government deposits. And also, this was the kicker, he didn't think that gold, silver, copper coins were enough because they're stagnant, they're stable. He wanted to see big booms. And so he wanted to issue paper money like they had during the Revolutionary War. Now, he didn't want them, and credit to him, he didn't want them to issue paper money willy-nilly like the Americans had under the Revolution, which failed. What he wanted was them to issue paper money with gold and reserves, but fractional reserves. So, how do I explain this? Basically, he wanted there to be gold to back your paper money dollar, but he realized that when most people bring their gold to the bank to trade in for paper money, that they often don't come and pick up their gold. Only about 10% of the time does that happen. So he wanted 10% of gold to be in the bank. He only wanted about 10% of the gold to be in the bank. So the money supply could expand, but not as exponentially as did the revolution. So credit for him to that, even though I think this financial system put us on the downhill. But yeah, he saw more credit, more lending, and more spending. He wanted more. He wanted the United States spend in manufacturing and make sure that business does well. And he really wanted this close tie between the government and business. And so he raised taxes really high, especially on whiskey. You can read about the Whiskey Rebellion. A lot of farmers weren't having it. I mean, the United States, come on, it was partly founded on getting away from taxes. And all of a sudden, this administration, all of us, is acting like Britain. And of course, the rebellion was crushed. And teachers teach you what a good thing it was that these farmers rebelled against taxes and then got crushed, because how horrible, you're probably a racist bigot if you hate taxes. But yes, Hamilton wanted an elitist, strong government tied to business and the wealthy and the elite. And he wanted big, credit expansion and lending and paper money and big booms in the economy. Jefferson knew that artificial money was evil. It expanded credit way beyond wealth. It created inflation, created these boom-bust cycles. Everyone would think there's so much money, and then when they realize there isn't, bust. And it created an illusion of prosperity when there really wasn't one. And debt is bad. The borrower is slave to the lender. That's true, and Jefferson knew that. And in permanent debt, a country is never free. It taxes and borrows and rinses and repeats. And the less independence we have, the less freedom we have. And Hamilton's system won over in the short term. But Jefferson's side stood a chance, and for most of American history, there was kind of a back and forth from the Jeffersonian original constitutional system to this Hamilton system, which was blatantly anti-constitutional, but our government hates the Constitution because it doesn't allow it to do what it wants. But for instance, Hamilton's system won over in the first 20 years or so of American history. The great President Andrew Jackson, though, ended that. He discovered massive fraud in the national bank and destroyed it in the 1830s and completely paid off the national debt to $0. The only president to do so. But then it went back and forth, back and forth. For example, President Lincoln, who you might like, but he's not maybe the great man you think he is, wanted to bring back the national bank and paper money, and then inflation got out of control, and then it was reeled in again. So what happened during the times that there was no central bank, the government had a stable money supply, and it rewarded people that were hardworking. Because as economic activity expanded, past maybe the amount of gold, prices would lower for people. And obviously, the legal rate of how much your gold is worth had to change as economic activity expanded, but prices would continue to fall for people as there was more efficiency. It was really a beautiful thing. Now, individual banks were able to put out paper money, and people trusted a lot of individual banks to do so. And a lot of individual banks often failed. They got out of control with borrowing and lending. But the beautiful thing was that it was just individual banks. It wouldn't take the whole system down. If one bank failed, that didn't mean the other one did. But a lot of people were mad about trusting these banks and having them fail. And there started to be talk of needing regulation of banks because a lot of people were losing out on money. And it really became a political issue. The most powerful American families found an opportunity to centralize control over the financial system because there was this talk of regulation. And so a lot of the most powerful men in banking met together and came up with an idea to create a private bank chartered by the government that would run the nation's financial system. And it would be shrouded in the fact that it would prevent banks from failing and going under, and it would be a reform system. We're going to make things stable. These private banks won't go under anymore, and they won't lend wildly, and you can trust us because we'll make sure the banks stay in line. But what was the real intention? It meant that very high up wealthy bankers could assert regulatory control over the whole system and benefit themselves. And they pitched the idea to the government, and the government loved it because now they could have more money to spend. We eventually got off this gold standard, and we loved it. The government loved it because they could have as much money to spend as the Federal Reserve created. And the money would be considered valuable by law instead of having actual value. And obviously, it has been devastating. They have controlled the financial system so that money expands, prices get higher every year by design. The US dollar has lost 94% of its purchasing power since 1924. And they often expand the money supply, and when they realize there's a bubble, they tightly contract it. And it gives us these boom and bust cycles. And then when the recessions happen, they spend even more money because they say that they need to get us out of the pinch. And so the government has this almost cartel-like control over the money supply. And you can thank this for the debt and inflation. And as inflation continues to go up, it is crippling our future generations. And the debt is even worse because it threatens our ability to survive as a civilization. So the question is, where do we go from here? I don't know about you, but 39 trillion is a breaking point for me. Because it's at the point that I can't just sit back and let this happen anymore. And you can tune this out, but it's going to affect you. This is not a political issue that is unrelated to your life. And Gen Z, I'm talking to you when I say this. This is putting your whole life in jeopardy. I mean, your ability to afford a house, your ability to afford medical care, your ability to live freely, and your government's ability to survive this beautiful country designed by our founding fathers. Will it be able to survive? And at some point, we have to draw a line in the sand and say, no, we're done. We're done spending this money. We're done with the Federal Reserve. We're done with inflation. And how is this gonna work exactly? Well, we have an election season coming up. We have the 2026 midterms. A lot of young people don't turn out for that. I think the Democrats are gonna win because Congress, there isn't that much power there. There isn't that much power to change things since it's such a big body. And I'm just content to hope the best that, the best people win. They won't. Democrats will win. They'll hurt our country even more. But that's not where the power is. 2028 will be interesting because what is needed to save us from this crisis is a strong executive, someone like Andrew Jackson, who will go after the Federal Reserve at any personal cost, that will slash these programs, even though they're unpopular, just because it is important to the nation. We need a man to run for president that will put America first, the interests of America first, over the donors, over what's politically popular, over feelings, what is truly needed to save our country. And people need to be thrown in jail. Illegal systems need to be overturned. We need to be getting back to the hard money principles that our government was founded on. We need to be getting back to that, and the whole system needs to burn down. It is not benefiting us anymore. They don't care about the future, and something must change. And that's all I'll say now. I want you to really seriously think on these things. And this is not over. I don't have all the answers yet, but I want to be able to do my best to educate, explain, and try and lead us into a better place. And that's what the finish line is all about, is bringing the right ideas to the forefront, and that we make sure that these good policies go to their conclusion. Thank you.